Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Patty Chapin. I am the Rudnick Fellow for the Alliance Heritage Center of Stockton University. We're co-hosting this event with the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center. And before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to thank Tom Kinsella, who's the Elizabeth and Samuel Levin Director of the Alliance Heritage Center. I'd like to thank Irvin Marina Rodriguez, the director of the Holocaust Resource Center of Stockton University, and also Brett Roach and Rebecca Rodriguez. At the end of the discussion, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the chat and we'll try to read as many as possible. We're also recording this session so we can share it with those who couldn't join us tonight. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Seth Stern's a legal journalist and author of Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, Holocaust Survivors on South Jersey Poultry Farms. His grandparents were Holocaust survivors who settled on a Vineland, New Jersey chicken farm, which is where his mother grew up. He also co-authored Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion, and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. His discussion tonight will focus on the roughly 1,000 Holocaust survivors who found an unlikely refuge and gateway to new lives as poultry farmers in southern New Jersey. His book, Speaking Yiddish to Chickens, tells the remarkable story of loss, renewal, and perseverance in the most unexpected of settings. So thank you for being with us tonight, Seth.
Well, thank you, Patty, so much for the invitation, and for Tom for facilitating this. This is my third time talking to a Stockton-affiliated audience, including a wonderful event in Atlantic City in January. Some of you might have attended that event or heard the earlier webinar I did with Michael Hayes when the book came out last year. So I'm going to have a somewhat different focus today after giving an overview and a focus that's particularly appropriate for an event hosted by the Alliance Heritage Center. For those of you less familiar with the book, this project began more than 25 years ago. I was home on Long Island studying for my first semester of law school exams in December 1998, and I visited my grandmother each day over lunch as I started talking to her about different phases of her life. We talked about growing up in Lublin, Poland, surviving the war, hiding in an underground dugout with my grandfather, and then coming to the U.S. as refugees. But the part of her story that came to fascinate me the most is how my grandparents and roughly 1,000 other Holocaust survivors came to settle as poultry farmers in southern New Jersey. Now, this is a personal story, and I explore in the book how my family and my grandmother's childhood friend, they're pictured here, the two women on the right. This is the image on the book cover. My grandmother is on the right, her close friends on the left. Their daughters, my mother is the darker-haired girl, and how they came to share a farm and live together for a number of years, raising their daughters basically as twins. But it's also a broader story about how Jews came to be farmers in the United States and why survivors wound up in this unique South Jersey community anchored by Vineland, New Jersey. So South Jersey, as many of you know, has always played a central role in the story of American Jewish agriculture, starting in the 1880s when idealistic young Russian Jews established communal farming colonies in South Jersey. Unlike elsewhere in the U.S., where most such colonies quickly fail due to bad weather, the farmers' inexperience, malaria, the ones in Alliance and elsewhere in South Jersey endured, at least for a time, thanks in part to the help of what would become the Jewish Agricultural Society. By the early 20th century, the Jewish Agricultural Society had largely given up on communal colonies, which proved unable to sustain themselves without serious subsidies, and focused instead on settling Jews on individual farms. This is the Jewish Farmer, the monthly English Yiddish, only English Yiddish farm magazine of its kind that the Jewish Agricultural Society sent to Jewish farmers all over the country with news from the industry and farming tips. This is the last issue that was published in 1958. In the 1930s, Jews were farming in all then existing 48 states, but they were mostly concentrated in the Northeast, from the Berkshires in Massachusetts into Connecticut, the Catskills in New York, into central New Jersey communities like Farmingdale, Toms River, and Lakewood. And the form of farming that tended to work out the best was chicken farming. It required less capital, it was less physically demanding, and it required less land. So when the first Jewish refugees to make it out of Germany arrived during the Great Depression, the Jewish Agricultural Society saw poultry farming as a great solution, and it looked to South Jersey as an ideal place to direct them, since farms there were cheaper than in central New Jersey or the Berkshires, Connecticut, and the Catskills. These displaced persons, as they were known, had lost their families and came to the U.S. without much money and knew little English. They were attracted to farming by the promise of being their own boss and the fact that, as my book title suggests, the chickens didn't care if you spoke Yiddish to them. Survivors dissatisfied with life in New York or whichever big city they'd initially landed in usually heard about poultry farming by word of mouth, whether it was a distant relative or a landsman from their hometown back in Europe, or someone they met after the war in a displaced persons camp. Many newcomers who had never farmed before and had little idea of what it involved expected farming would be easy. Here are two of the refugee farming families in South Jersey. The son on the right refers to this picture as their version of American Gothic. But the reality of farm life was much different. At first, the timing worked out in their favor. These new arrivals who suffered so much during World War II benefited from the start of the Korean War, which drove up demand for eggs, and egg prices reached all-time highs in 1951. In this era, poultry was king in Vineland. You could see here, this is the logo of the high school sports teams in that time, known as the Poultry Clan. The city had billboards boasting of it being home of the Vineland eggs. And Vineland even hosted a poultry festival that boasted the world's largest frying pan. This is from the first poultry festival in 1954. At the time, there were hundreds of local poultry farms, including 500 or so purchased by Holocaust survivors alone. There were 17 feed mills, 25 hatcheries, and poultry dealers operating in the area. Many of these businesses were Jewish-owned, such as the Jacob Rubinoff feed mill, which was the largest of its kind in the eastern United States. The Vineland egg auction in that era was shipping 600,000 cases of eggs, that's 18 million eggs, to New York City in the mid-1950s. Poultry would become the top agricultural enterprise in the state, and 4 New Jersey counties ranked in the top 10 in the entire nation in terms of chickens. Now, at the time, to give you some sense of the scale of agriculture, the typical family poultry farm in Vineland had roughly 10 acres and housed 3,000 or 4,000 chickens. Most were raising them for eggs. Others sold them for meat. And as I've learned in a prior talk I gave, people said some people raised turkeys, so I don't want to leave out the turkeys. Even in the best of times, this was dirty, difficult work. You had to wake up early in the morning to make sure the chickens' water didn't freeze. You couldn't take a day off of work easily because the chickens needed to eat 7 days a week, and 365 days a year. Viruses wiped out whole flocks. Wild dogs would snatch them in the night. The hens were nasty when cooped up together and could peck each other to death or smother each other in a panic during air raid drills, which were frequent during the Cold War. The stench of their waste would be overpowering. Brooder stoves used to keep baby chicks warm could catch fire and burn down the coops. The economics were tough even in good years, and finding reliable laborers proved challenging. Most of the newcomers who arrived during this period, particularly the refugees, had never farmed before and had no idea what they were doing. Many had grown up in big cities and found it isolating to live on a farm. Others who had moved to the farm from crowded New York apartments found comfort in having so much land to themselves, even if they had to share it with several thousand hens. Many newcomers who had hoped for a stable, quiet life recoiled at the uncertainty. Some dropped out of the poultry business as soon as they arrived, but many more of these new farmers stuck it out. As one farm wife later recalled, you'd be surprised how fast you could learn if you're in a jam. We had to make a living and take care of the children, and you just did it. We were fast learners. We had to be. These survivors built and supplemented what was already a very robust Jewish community full of the descendants of the original colony settlers and then the German Jewish refugees, and they made it their own. They built shtiebels, or small shuls, often with their own hands, within walking distance of their farms. They created the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association, a Landsmannschaft, or combination mutual aid society and social club like the ones earlier generations of immigrants established in big cities. Their Farband, Yiddish for association, as they called it, hosted dinner dances, and stars of the Yiddish stage, comedians, poets, and journalists, often themselves displaced persons, would perform to standing room only crowds at the local middle school and high school, the only venues large enough to host hundreds of people. They also commemorated what later became known as the Holocaust, usually in April, to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. These survivors, known as Greena, which was a play on the term for greenhorn, later remembered feeling unwelcome by the existing Jewish community. Some recalled American-born Jews could be downright cruel, with comments about how they must have done something wrong to end up in prison camps. I found it difficult so many decades after the fact to tease out exactly what explains these community dynamics. What survivors experienced as cruelty might have been fumbling attempts by American-born Jews, unsure about what to say, unintentionally saying the wrong thing. Even the most well-meaning American Jews found it difficult to relate to survivors face to face. They had no conception of what survivors had endured or how to talk to them. Some survivors may have avoided American-born Jews because they felt self-conscious around them, although the earlier German Jewish refugees had recalled feeling equally unwelcome when they arrived. The German Jews and post-war survivors largely stayed apart at first, with both feeling most comfortable among their own. But, and this is the part of the story that I thought that I wanted to talk about, particularly with this audience and with a focus or a connection to Alliance. What struck me in looking at oral histories and then interviewing survivors or their children, even among the people who felt so unwelcome, they often cited the same person who stood out for offering them a warm and generous welcome. And that's Harry Levin, who was the Jewish Agricultural Society's local attorney, who at the time the survivors were arriving was a 40-something-year-old country lawyer and a one-man welcome wagon. Levin accompanied families on farm tours. He prepared purchase documents and hosted the closings on farms, often looking the other way when clients couldn't afford the fee. Levin, who was born shortly after the dawn of the 20th century in 1905, was a bridge between South Jersey's farm colony era and the later generations of refugees and post-war survivor farmers. He was as close to royalty as the original colony of Jewish agricultural settlers in Alliance ever produced. His maternal grandfather, a Russian-born lawyer, was one of two scouts who searched the New Jersey countryside for the site of a colony. His grandfather later named the Colony Alliance to recognize the organization that aided the newcomers, one of the organizations. His mother was one of the first children born at the colony. His father moved there at age 9, a member of another of Alliance's original 43 settler families. Levin remembered his childhood in Alliance as something out of Fiddler on the Roof. On Fridays, everyone rushed to finish their work and get ready for Shabbat before services began at one of the colony's 4 synagogues. His grandfather served as Alliance's Justice of the Peace for 40 years, relying as much on Talmudic as civil law for his rulings. Levin thought he'd become a rabbi, but instead attended the University of Pennsylvania's business and law schools. He then returned to Vineland and opened a law office on Landis Avenue. I don't think he ever would have left this area, his daughter Marcia told me. He was a country boy. Levin eventually settled in the family farmhouse in Alliance, right next to the cemetery. He liked to joke that his neighbors were great, they kept to themselves, and were never any trouble. Levin could speak a half dozen languages, including Yiddish, German, and French, and he taught Hebrew school on the side to help pay the rent early in his legal career. He had a generalist small-town solo practice handling tax preparation, trust and estates, occasional divorce, real estate, a bit of immigration. Fortunately, there was enough of it to keep me in business, Levin later said. I didn't want to be a rich lawyer, I just wanted to do my job. His generation of Ivy League educated Jewish professionals never felt fully accepted as Americans. They were still subject to subtle forms of anti-Semitism, if not the cross-burnings of a generation earlier. When Levin called up a favorite seafood restaurant in Atlantic City for a weekend dinner reservation, the maitre d' told him they were booked as soon as he heard Levin's Jewish-sounding name. A friend with a non-Jewish-sounding name then called up and secured the reservation immediately. This insecurity, in part, explains why some of Levin's contemporaries may have resented the refugees. They reminded other Americans that Jews were different at a time when American Jews just wanted to fit in. To his credit, though, Levin did everything he could to help the refugees, starting with the German Jews. At times, he acted as both real estate lawyer and press agent. In a 1948 interview, he insisted that Jewish refugees, quote, make excellent farmers, contrary to the popular belief that Jews are at home only in trade. Levin was equally helpful to the post-war arrivals. His children joked he wouldn't have made anyone pay if his wife Dorothy wasn't the one who sent out the bills. In all, Levin would formally help more than 100 Jewish refugee families, including my grandparents, settle on farms, and informally he helped many more. Why was he so generous? He felt a genuine kinship with Jewish farmers. His father still operated his own egg farm in the 1950s, retiring only around 1954 when he was nearly 80 years old. His brother Manny, who also lived in Alliance, was a chicken and egg dealer. On the wall of his law office, right in the middle of the framed diplomas and awards, Levin hung the certificate from Rutgers proving he'd completed a course in egg and poultry farming. Good deeds just came naturally to Levin, who volunteered for all sorts of local civic and religious causes. He was the sort of person who helps hold a community together. He was president of the local bar association, trustee of the historical society, fire commissioner in Pittsgrove Township, secretary of B'nai B'rith. He loved showing off the photos he took on his foreign travels and showed off the skulls and other collectibles he acquired on these trips abroad during lectures at local synagogues and Rotary Club meetings. His wife Dorothy was equally civic-minded, serving more than a decade on their local school board. Levin was later appointed a part-time municipal judge in his local township, and his favorite part of the job was officiating weddings, something he did with such frequency and such joy in the decades ahead that he became known as the marrying judge. This was purely a labor of love for Levin. Municipal judges couldn't charge for their services. He usually earned no more than a wedding invitation and a free dinner. That's why I got this, Levin told a reporter, pointing to his potbelly. Whatever his motivation, the Grinna would remain deeply appreciative of his help. Many years later, one of the farmers acknowledged all he had done for the post-war refugees, most of whom had lost their parents, in a tribute with the highest possible compliment. He was always like a father to us, and he deserves a real thank you for his devotion and his generous character. Now, the Jewish Agricultural Society, Levin, and the survivors didn't know it at the time, but these refugees had entered poultry farming at the worst possible moment. Small family farms were finding it increasingly hard to compete with mega farms in the South that had much lower labor costs and could support 50,000, 100,000, and ultimately a million birds. In October 1954, Hurricane Hazel, bear with me while I try to, Hurricane Hazel barreled through Vineland, peeling roofs off of coops like the lids of tin cans and killing or leaving homeless tens of thousands of birds. This is one of the coops you could see where some of the walls and the roof were ripped off. Given the hard times ahead, the lucky ones might actually have been the farmers who lost everything and used insurance proceeds to start over in a new business or in an entirely different place. Farm families looked for other ways to supplement their income as egg prices dropped. Many farm wives, including my grandmother, found work at Vineland garment factories. Some tried branching out into farm-adjacent businesses, such as cracked eggs for bakeries or processing kosher chickens. Others would abandon farming altogether. As the 1960s progressed, they found it increasingly hard to make a living, and many began abandoning their farms, which no one would buy, or abandoning South Jersey altogether to find better work elsewhere. My grandparents and my mother stayed until she graduated high school there in 1964. Nearly every farm eventually ceased operating, and the Jewish community began to shrink, just as similar rural communities had already contracted almost everywhere else in America. This is a photo of the farm directly across the road from where my mom grew up. You could see here it was the coops. The family remained in the house, but they abandoned their coops, which were ultimately torn down. Now, in 1973, there was still a number listed for the Jewish Agricultural Society in the Vineland phone directory, and it rang in Harry Levin's law office, although no one had called him on JAS business for years. In the years that followed, Levin did his best to preserve the area's Jewish history, writing a history of the original Alliance colony his family helped found. He collected synagogue charters and old farm tools and served as a source for researchers and scholars studying the region's Jewish agricultural past. By 1981, he'd lost sight in one eye, and his wife had to chauffeur him around to perform weddings. After a car accident landed him in the hospital, he performed at least one wedding ceremony in the hospital room rather than disappoint the couple. The groom was to be, he was in the Air Force and had to leave for Hawaii that night. 2 nurses were the witnesses, and Harry married them while lying in the bed. I was glad to do it, he said. His days as the marrying judge ended in 1982 when he wasn't reappointed municipal court judge in Pittsgrove, but he kept on practicing law until a few months before his death in 1988 at age 83. Of all the people I write about in the book, I wish I had a chance to meet Harry Levin, which I didn't have the opportunity to do. But it's funny today, and just Googling him in preparation for this talk, I came across a series of interviews he'd done as part of a project researching South Jersey's Jewish agricultural past. These are 4 interviews from 1978, and just today I heard his voice for the first time. I'm glad that in writing this book, I had a chance to tell a little bit of his story along with the survivor farmers he helped. So that's the formal part of the program. I hope that people heard something new. If you had listened to me talk about the book before, I'd be happy to answer any questions people might have. And thank you very much for participating tonight.
Okay, thank you, Seth. You can ask questions through the Zoom chat feature, which should be at the bottom of your computer screen, or I will do my best to see any hands that are raised through the Zoom button also at the bottom of your screen, and I will be more than happy to unmute you to ask Seth your question. So Abe, I think you are raising your hand, so I will unmute you now, Abe. You should be able to unmute. Abe, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I maybe get one question in. Most of us here have read your book. It was very enlightening. My kids really liked it. They read it when they had that. We didn't grow up in. We mostly visited Vineland. We were out in Bears Head, which is on Millville Road, Pittsburgh Avenue, closer to Mays Landing, and it was a very different time. But every one of us always went to Vineland. You went there to Goldstein's Delicatessen. You went to pick those things up. So those are very fond memories. Your book really helped my kids realize what was happening with us. I have to thank you for writing that much. Thank you very much for doing that.
That's very kind of you. And in writing this, the worry was my mom left in my grandparents in 1964. I wasn't born till a decade later. I never experienced this or witnessed this firsthand. And in trying to capture it so many years later, would I do it accurately? And that was my worry, that people who had lived through it would say, you have no idea what you're talking about. So it is heartening to hear people say that it accurately, whether they liked the result or not, at least it was an accurate representation of life at that time.
Thank you for your question, Abe. Barbara, I'll ask for you to unmute. Barbara Roth.
Hi, Seth. I had heard you once before, and I'm not quite done your book, but I used to be at your house all the time. I was good friends with Linda Hyman, and my brother was best friends with Arnold. Leah Letterman lived across the street,
Sure.
and Bonnie Wyman was my best friend. And I know that Helen and you have been in touch. And then I also know Harriet Liebel, Susie. I mean, the whole gang, and everybody used Judge Levin. That was fascinating to hear. You have such a great story. I just love what you did with this book, and it's so interesting. How did you get all this information? Like, if I didn't know about the relationship with your parents and the Lermans, that was I'm still not finished, but I'm going to try to finish in the next.
Sure.
If I have any questions, can I get your email?
Yeah, absolutely. yiddishtochickens@gmail.com. Anyone who has any questions. I have a Facebook page with a lot more photos. Facebook.com/yiddishtochickens. So feel free to reach out either of those ways. In terms of the research, as I mentioned in the talk, I started out interviewing my grandmother and my mom, just with the goal of preserving our family history, and then broadened it out. Started interviewing others, seeking out oral histories. Some of them, the Jewish Federation in South Jersey had the foresight to collect in the early 2000s. And that was a great resource, and oral histories that were done by the Shoah Foundation and other organizations. And then a lot of archival research, the Jewish Agricultural Society's records at the Center for Jewish History in New York, went through on microfilm in the Vineland Public Library, which was the only place to read the Vineland Times Journal for years until it was mercifully digitized, and anyone could read it now on newspapers.com. So all of that, and then connecting, let me put in a plug for Stockton and the research they're doing into the survivors in the region, and sharing our findings and helping quantify a little bit the scale and the scope of the survivor settlement in South Jersey. So it was a combination of my background as a journalist and an amateur historian.
I just wanted to say what a good job you did. I remember your mother too. So
that's very nice.
I'm quelling at this book. I think it's so fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Now, when Irvin and Gail of blessed memory,
yes,
and Michael Hayes had spoken about finding you and to work on this project when the whole archive started, just having you add all this whole different realm of. Really, you give such a background to things, because I was young and I didn't know. My parents didn't talk about it. I only knew all my friends, and I only knew that we went to Nora Beach and hung out together and did a lot of the things you said. So, and I know that a lot of the older generation, like Helen Wyman and Harriet Liebel, like that group still has a lot of groups that the kids still get together, but because we were younger, we didn't. So. Thank you. It's fascinating, and I might reach out to you and ask you a lot.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Barbara.
I'll mute myself.
Abe, Rob, would you unmute?
Yeah, one of the things I miss, we used to always every summer be at the beach, and it was really a Jewish beach in Norma, just south of the Alliance Cemetery. And I don't know if you wrote much about it, but it really was an amazing little place. Not much more than a little place on Morris River.
Yeah, it's amazing. In speaking with people and reading people's accounts and oral histories, Alliance or Norma Beach, I tried to capture the scene and just the how the kids would play in the water and come out covered in brown specks, and the older kids would be at the jukebox, and the parents would be playing cards and gossiping in Yiddish or Polish or whatever language. And it really was, everyone had such warm memories of that. And so I really did try to capture that, and it is gone now. I know I've not visited myself, but in people's descriptions, it became polluted, and the covered air, the concession stand burned down, and it's not the same today. But in its day, it really was a very special place.
Yes, it was.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abe. And Barry Cohen, I'll ask if you can unmute, please.
Thank you. We have your book in 2 locations, Seth, and I have yet to read it in either, but I just wanted to tell you, I promised to read it. And Alliance speech was polluted then, we just didn't know it. But your portrait of Judge Levin was right on. I just, he arranged for the purchase of the farm for my grandparents, dealt with the estates of my parents and my grandparents. But the interesting or the thing I'd like to share is that I knew Old Man Levin. I mean, I never knew his first name. He was always Old Man Levin. My Zeta was the Baal Kriya of the Alliance Shul and lived just up the street, across the street from his sister Sarah and brother-in-law Sam Spain. And so my Zeta would pick me up after my before my bar mitzvah, but especially after, to make the minyan. And, one of the 10 or 11 men left was Old Man Levin, who had founded Alliance. And so anyway, Mazel Tov on your portrait of his son. He really was a giant in the Vineland community. So thank you.
Thank you. And I should say, I do think that Harry Levin was singular, but there were other people who were helpful to the survivors. I described Ben Leuchter, the publisher of the local newspaper, the Times Journal, and how he covered this community with such humanity. And he became president of Hayas. And not only that, but, the Voice of Israel, which was founded in the 1940s, which was the oldest Zionist radio program before Zionism got a bad name recently. It was the oldest Zionist radio program in the country. There were a lot of pillars in that community, both original ones and certainly survivors. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. There's someone under Wendy's iPad next.
That's me. Thank you very much. My name is John Sinton, Sinton, and I have done some work, as Tom Kinsella may know, on the Pine Barrens. Love the book. It's a wonderful contribution. Thanks so much for it. Question is, since I come from 19th century Germans who went to California, when you speak of the Germans in Vineland, German Jews in Vineland, I know you're not speaking about the 1850s, 1860s bunch that went to the West. Could you explain what the status was of German Jews, those German Jews?
Yeah.
And the Russian and the Polish?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamics in Vineland were a little different, where in New York, the German Jews were some of the earlier settlers and became the establishment, some of the wealthiest business people in New York. And they were the establishment who looked down on the Russian Jews who came later and emigrated in mass after them. In Vineland, it was something of the inverse, because the original colony settlers were Russian Jews, and they were more well established by the late 30s when the German and Austrian Jews came. Those refugees tended to be older, well-educated. These, in many cases, were professionals, doctors, lawyers, and it was very sad. They came to the U.S. with basically nothing, or and they were reduced to wearing the gowns or whatever they might have worn to an opera in Vienna to clean up a chicken coop. And when their fancy clothes were worn out, some had to resort to the feed bags and turn that into clothing or window shades. So it was a pretty desperate situation for many of those refugees who came in the late 30s and 40s, and they kept to themselves. They created their own group similar to the Jewish Poultry Farmers Association. Theirs was called the Poultrymen's Club. It had a storefront, I think, above a photo studio on Landis Avenue, and Saturday nights they would gather and listen to German philosophers and historians and musicians, and eat food that were sort of comfort foods from home. And so they had their own synagogue, and they had their own community. And then they were sort of outnumbered by the post-war influx of Eastern European Jews. So if there were 100 or 200 or whatever it might have been of the German and Austrian refugees, there were many times that of the post-war arrivals.
Thank you, Seth. That's very good. And Tom, props to you. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Seth. Joe Zaywid, would you please be able to unmute?
I think.
Oh, hi.
There you
go. I went to school with your mother, Ruthie Green.
Yeah.
She was. I graduated in '63. She graduated in 1964 with my sister. A quick rundown. Okay, I was born in Poland, 1945. Immigrated to the United States 75 years ago. My 75th anniversary of the arrival was 2 weeks ago, in May of 1949. We wound up on a chicken farm in Dorothy in 1954. And my parents, it was wonderful. They had hundreds of Polish survivors. They had dinners and they played cards together. Kids played together for about 10 years. It was a wonderful life. They built synagogues all over South Jersey. Every 5 or 10 miles, there was a Jewish synagogue in Dorothy, New Jersey, obviously in Vineland, the Key City, Laureldale, so forth. An amazing thing happened. Well, I was bar mitzvahed in 1958, and Dorothy hired a weekend rabbi to come down from New York City. His name was Shlomo Karlbach. So he did my bar mitzvah in 1958. But I read his life story, and he got tired of listening to chicken farmers talking about eggs and chickens, so he went back to New York, eventually went to California, became the hippie rabbi, became very famous. A Broadway play was written about him called The Soul Doctor. So I found that out later in life, but that was what always fascinates me. Economically, what happened was two things. The egg industry started moving to the soybean belt in the Midwest and the South. And also the U.S. Department of Agriculture had price supports on soybeans and corn or wheat, two of the three products used to make chicken feed. But they never had price supports on eggs. And in 1964, the price of eggs dropped to 29 cents a dozen, and all the farmers were wiped out. So that's when we left Dorothy. We went to Atlantic City. Friends went to Philadelphia, Toronto, some stayed in Vineland. But that's what happened economically, and it was sad. And another sad thing was all the synagogues eventually became Ukrainian churches, and they're still functioning today whenever we visit. But that's okay. I mean, ironically, the Ukrainians and the Jews were friendly. We produced eggs, they produced butter. We should trade eggs for butter. So we sort of became buddies. With the Italian farmers, we used to make wine together. Getting back to the social life, I remember in 1956, one of my father's friends bought a new Pontiac, and the next person bought a Pontiac, and all of a sudden there were 6 or 7 new Pontiacs driving around Dorothy. All the kids went to high school. We did well. A lot of us went to Rutgers, did well. And it was a great life. And I'm very, very proud to have been part of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Seth, we do have a question in the chat, so I will read this. There's a guest that's asking, is there a lot of interest in the book outside of this area? And I'm going to assume by this area, they mean southern New Jersey.
Well, I mean, look, this is not going to be Harry Potter, right? I mean, but I've been heartened by the response, the reception. And twofold, I would say the community might have only been 500 families, or let's say 1,000 survivors and their children, or maybe in that, but their children, their grandchildren, and now their great grandchildren have spread out all over. And so I've done talks in Houston, in Florida, and Virginia Beach, or wherever I've done talks in person or virtually. People will come up to me and say, this was my story. This was my parents' story. This was my grandparents' story. So it is broader. This small community has spread out, and it's the descendants are all over the country. But I would say it has, there are people with no connection to this community that have found it to be an interesting story. And that's what I had hoped, that this little known story about Jewish American history would resonate with people beyond South Jersey. And it has, and it's been nice. And there was a nice amount of attention within the Jewish press last year when the book came out. So I can't complain about the response or how widely read it is. And I was saying, if anyone prefers audiobooks, that's coming out in a couple weeks, I think 2 weeks from today. And I should also say, as this isn't self-promotion, I've said before, all of the proceeds from the book, that whatever modest royalties, it's all going to the Jewish Federation, the Vineland Public Library, the Vineland Historical Society, and the Center for Jewish History. So I had already, whatever royalties I received for the first year, I sent all those organizations were the beneficiaries, and I'll continue to do that as long as there are any royalties from the book.
Well, thank you, Seth. That's quite generous and amazing. You are an amazing person. And as a follow-up to that question...
That, you see, you sounded like Gail there. You're really channeling her. It's pretty good.
Yes, we miss her dearly. And as a follow-up to that question, someone in the chat is asking, how relevant is this book now in a time of growing anti-Semitism and anti-Jewishness?
I think it is relevant. I thought of that. I happen to be writing this at a time when there was a lot of hostility towards refugees from Syria, and I saw a real parallel to the way that the displaced persons, the Jewish refugees, were described. There was resistance to letting them into this country in 48 and 50 at the time of the Displaced Persons Act, which modestly raised the limits on restrictions on Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. And there was this notion that these people were going to be subversives, communists. They were going to come into this country and form an underground and help the Soviet Union. And I saw a real parallel in how some politicians were talking about Syrian refugees and that they were going to be subversive element in this country. In terms of the anti-Semitism, yeah, for sure. I mean, you see that that was certainly part of the story in why they were being described as subversives. You saw that. I talk about the welcome they had among some in the Jewish community and many in the non-Jewish community, the warmth that some of the Italian-American residents showed in Vineland. But that there was also anti-Semitism, and they experienced that. There was a lot of pride in Israel. I write in the book about the connections they felt as farmers and the budding agricultural movement in Israel. And a very unfortunate, I don't want to say connection, but Jonathan Dekel-Chen, who is one of the foremost experts on Jewish agriculture in the world, and he was a visiting professor at Rutgers while I was writing this, and he was generous in sharing his thoughts on the manuscript. And his family was on the kibbutz that was attacked on October 7th. His son is among those in captivity. And it just shows one little link between the Jewish agricultural story and what happened in October.
Well, thank you, Seth. And Marion, I'm going to ask you to please unmute to ask your question. Marion Blakeman.
Okay. I have a question for Seth. I've read the book. I just have like one or two more chapters left. But recently, well, not recently, in the last several years, I had questioned where the chicken farm I grew up on Delsey Drive, I thought it was my grandparents', which it wasn't. And I later found out they were missing in Shanghai and then brought to the United States to Vineland. I'm questioning Seth if he knew of what I did find out was there were some Italians in Vineland that gave my uncle and aunt money to start their chicken farm. And now I found out that uncle had a chicken farm, started another one, and then asked my father to come from New York because he went to New York from Cuba and to run it, and he said he would. So my question to Seth is, has he found any other Italian families that help Jewish families start their life here in Vineland?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly examples. There was one Italian-American farmer who had a Jewish, he started basically as a laborer or helper on his farm. He helped him buy his own farm, and they were older, they didn't have children, and when they weren't in great health, this Italian-American farmer would bring them, if they were to say yortzeit at the local synagogue, to get their meat slaughtered in a kosher manner. He would take their livestock to get butchered. And that same farmer would take another Jewish family's child who had serious heart problems to the hospital in Philadelphia to get the care they need. So that's just one example of so there are remarkable stories of generosity, both within the Jewish community in Vineland and the Italian American community in Vineland towards the survivors. Not everyone was the picture of generosity, but there are certainly examples of that.
You gave an example of, and I won't say the name, of someone who was told by their mother not to befriend the Jewish immigrants.
Right, yeah.
And I was shocked.
That's part of the story too. Whether there were the earlier German Jewish or the earlier Eastern European settlers, whether it was insecurity and they didn't feel settled and they didn't want these people with the funny accents, and there were these perceptions of the survivors, horrible perceptions that they were ruined and only the worst kind survived. And they were damaged, or, what kind of person could survive that? And so it was a terrible misperceptions. It wasn't only in Vineland. There are oral histories in other Jewish farming communities, including Petaluma, California, where you heard people say the same things. American-born Jews would talk about how these survivors were the worst kind of people, and it's unbelievable. But that's not only did they have to experience what they experienced in Europe, but then to come here and have to deal with that as well.
Well, and also being on the west side of the boulevard, all the immigrants were on the west side of the boulevard. American Jews were on the east side. So we didn't even go to elementary school with them or middle school. I met them in high school. So anyway, okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The book was great, though.
That's very nice of you to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary?
Seth, first of all, thank you. You're doing this great presentation. I come to you from the county of Monmouth. Interestingly, to corroborate your story, first of all, I sit in the house of my Italian grandmother, who, when they bought the property in the 50s, which corroborates with the chicken farmers of Jewish descent selling them. There was a Jewish farmer across the street that had another 5 acres. So there were two brothers who were Jewish who sold their properties, one to an Italian and one to a Jew. Meanwhile, my father in Mercer County was on a Jewish farm. But my question to you is, what was the situation once the Jewish farmers gave up farming? Did the Italians take over? Who took over those farms? And a part two to that, and again, I'm from Monmouth County, so I don't know all the history there, although I am familiar with Alliance. The family, the Brown family that owns NFI, were they affiliated at all with the Alliance, or have family affiliated with the groups you're talking about?
Well, I can't speak to that point, but on your first point, in terms of the sale, it varied. So there were some farmers who would try to scale up and compete with the mega farms of the South. So they'd go from 10,000 to 25,000 to 50,000 hens. They'd buy adjoining farms as people were abandoning them or selling them. So that was some. And there are still instances of Italian truck farmers, fruits and vegetables. There aren't many, if any, poultry farms in South Jersey. They tended to survive a little longer in central New Jersey. I have heard stories about in the Lakewood and Toms River area into the 70s, 80s. But for the most part, the farms, there were so many of them, and there was very little value. No one wanted to buy them for the most part. The average farmer had very few options. They had multiple mortgages because the Jewish Agricultural Society wasn't giving grants, wasn't just saying, here's a farm and handing over the keys. You had to take out a mortgage. They would do a second mortgage, sort of be a guarantor on your farm. But as the egg prices went down, people couldn't pay for their pay. They defaulted. They often went bankrupt. I think the Camden Federal Court had the highest agricultural bankruptcy rate in the country in the late 1950s. So most people, some would abandon in the middle of the night. There was no value left, and they would just flee in the middle of the night, fearful that the feed dealer would come by to collect the next morning. So there was a fair bit of that.
Right. And that too corroborates on my Jewish side. In the late 50s, they had to sell their farm for the same reasons, although they were in Mercer County. Interesting. Your facts are wonderful. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
They check out.
They do. Thank you.
Okay. Joe Zaywit?
Yes, hi. One more comment about that young lady who asked about the Italians and the Jews. My first job as a child was cleaning chicken coops, shoveling manure for $1 an hour. And the Italian vegetable farmers from Vineland would come up with their trucks. We would shovel manure there, and they would take it to their farm as fertilizer. So this was like an alliance between the Italian vegetable farmers and the Jewish poultry farmers. And that went on for many years. And my second job, also for $1 an hour, was catching chickens at night. Once the hens were about 5 years old, we would catch them, put them in wooden crates, and the Italian farmers, they had these big trucks, and we put them in these wooden chicken crates, and they would take them to Campbell's Soup to make chicken soup. So there was a fairly strong alliance between the Italians and the Jews back then in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, the Campbell's chicken soup, that is certainly a story in my family as well. And that when the chickens got older, the Campbell's truck would come along. They were based in Camden and collect the chickens. And so in my family, we would eat the tomato soup. We would eat the mushroom soup. We would not eat Campbell's chicken soup. But
All right. Thank you, Joe. Barbara, I think you had a question. Can you unmute, Barbara?
Yeah, real quick. One thing I noticed in the back of the credits of the people you interviewed or testimonies that you looked at was Elizabeth Roth, and that was through the Cumberland County, I guess, archives, which I heard that there were tapes of, but I haven't seen. I would like to see them. She was my mother-in-law who passed away recently, and Irvin just finished her memoir. So a blessed memory. And what I wanted to say when you were talking about the chickens, so they had a farm in Millville, And they ended up increasing their farm when most of people had gone out of business, including my parents. They ended up with over 30,000 chickens at a time. And then finally, they ended up selling their farm to Harry. No, they bought the Buena Vista Motel from Harry Kaseman. So that's how they finally got off the farm. But they really had quite the business going when my parents were off the farm before I was born. So I don't have any recollection. But I did see, one other thing I wanted to mention was I did see the picture of inside the synagogue. And I think the person who was davening, who was the cantor, might have been Irving Schock.
Yes. Yep.
Right?
Yep. Right. Yes. Yep.
He was my other best friend. So one thing I want to just mention to everyone about this area is that we were very not wealthy as far as monetary values go. But as far as growing up in this very unique microcosm of the city, it was amazing because although we weren't always welcomed by the non-Jewish families, there was enough of us that we just, all the sixth graders hung out together and we would go to Norma Beach. We would be there for all day. We would go and play in the muck. And then later we would go into where the picnic benches were, play pinball. I used to try to dance with the jukebox, as that was my thing. And if you found like bottles of empty soda, you got 2 cents, you could get a pretzel. So, and then we would stay there till late at night because the families would just play cards. And it was interesting because the Germans did stay away from like the Polish people, and my husband's family, who was Czechoslovakian, never went to Norma Beach because everybody tried to stay within their group. But, and I was just wanted to tell you that I just wanted to share that with you because I thought that was just a fascinating part of growing up there. We weren't rich as far as money, but we were rich in a way of life. And were you in touch with William Levin, Harry Levin's grandson?
Yes, yes. That's a part of the story I should have mentioned, and his efforts to bring agriculture back to their family property near Alliance. And it was
even
nice.
Stays there. He babysit for my kids. So what a small world. But this book, because as I was really reading it, it is really so wonderful that you've brought this whole story to light because it is a fascinating story. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And the selfish motivation, I would say, is that my niece and nephew, who are college age, and my son, and they met my grandmother, but my son, who was born a year after she died, he's now 8. And hopefully one day they'll all read this book and have a sense of it and have a better sense of their great-grandparents' experience. So I hope that's something similar in other families as well.
You did a great deed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. And thank you, everyone, for your comments and your questions. I think we had another amazing evening with the esteemed author and colleague and friend, Seth Stern. I know Mike Hayes was on the Zoom, and he was just smiling from ear to ear throughout the entire presentation because this is a labor of love for all of us, including from Dr. Chapin and Dr. Kinsella as well. And really channeling Gail, she always talked about Dina Wardy's book, Memorial Candles, and channeling Gail and thanking you on behalf of Gail, because I know she's smiling on all of us right now. Thank you so much for being the memorial candle for the Holocaust survivors of Southern New Jersey. And we hope to continue working together collaboratively on this project.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone.